The helicopter's rotors cut through the thick Afghan air as Lieutenant Sarah Chun pressed her face against the small window. Below, the rugged mountains stretched endlessly, hiding secrets that had claimed too many lives. She adjusted her tactical vest and checked her weapon for the third time in 10 minutes. This wasn't her first mission, but something about this one felt different. 2 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through her headset. Sarah glanced at her team. 6 elite Navy SEALs, each one a legend in their own right. Team leader Commander Jake Morrison sat across from her, his weathered face showing no emotion. These men had seen more combat than most soldiers could imagine. They had stormed beaches, cleared buildings, and eliminated high-value targets in the darkest corners of the world. Yet here they were, following her lead. 3 months earlier, Sarah had been analyzing satellite footage from her desk at the Pentagon. She was a military intelligence officer with a perfect record, but field operations weren't supposed to be her specialty. That changed when she discovered something that made every expert in Washington sit up and take notice. Hidden in a remote valley, she had identified a terrorist compound that had evaded detection for years. The location was so well concealed that even the most advanced reconnaissance had missed it. But Sarah noticed patterns in the terrain that others had overlooked. Supply routes that seemed to lead nowhere. Radio signals that appeared random, but followed a subtle rhythm. The target wasn't just another militant hideout. Intelligence suggested this was where Ahmed Hassan planned his operations. Hassan was one of the most wanted men in the world, responsible for attacks that had killed hundreds of innocent people. Every major military force had been hunting him for over a decade. "The valley you identified is a fortress," Morrison had told her during the briefing. "Natural walls on 3 sides, only one way in or out. If Hassan is really there, getting him won't be easy." Sarah had studied every detail of the terrain. The compound sat at the bottom of a narrow canyon, surrounded by rocky cliffs that rose 300 feet on either side. Anyone approaching would be completely exposed. It was the perfect defensive position, which explained why Hassan had remained hidden for so long. "That's exactly why we need to go," Sarah had replied. "He thinks he's untouchable there." The mission had taken weeks to plan. Traditional assault tactics wouldn't work. The approach was too narrow, too exposed. Any helicopter insertion would be detected long before they reached the target. Ground assault would mean crossing miles of open terrain under the watch of enemy spotters. But Sarah had found another way. Years of studying geological surveys had taught her to read landscapes differently than most soldiers. She discovered that an ancient riverbed ran along the eastern wall of the valley. Centuries of erosion had carved a series of caves and tunnels through the rock. Some were large enough for a person to crawl through. More importantly, they led directly behind the compound. "You're talking about a 3-hour crawl through solid rock," Morrison had said when she presented the plan. "In the dark, with full gear. And we don't even know if these passages are still open." "The geological data shows they should be," Sarah replied. "It's our only chance for surprise." The Pentagon brass had been skeptical. Sending a desk analyst on a special operations mission broke every protocol in the book. Sarah had never fired a shot in combat. Her experience was limited to training exercises and computer simulations. But she knew the terrain better than anyone else on Earth. She had memorized every rock, every shadow, every possible hiding spot in that valley. When the mission commander asked who should lead the team through the underground route, there was only one answer. "She goes," Morrison had said simply. "She found it. She knows it. She leads." Now, as the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 6 of America's finest warriors were trusting her with their lives. Families back home were counting on them to come back safely. The success of a mission that could change the course of the war depended on her ability to navigate through passages she had only seen in satellite images. The helicopter touched down with a soft thud. Morrison gave her a nod as the rear door opened. "Time to see if those computer screens taught you anything about the real world." Sarah stepped out into the Afghan night, her boots crunching on the rocky ground. The air was thin and cold at this altitude. Stars blazed overhead with an intensity impossible to see in any city. In the distance, barely visible against the mountains, lay their target. As the helicopter lifted off and disappeared into the darkness, Sarah shouldered her pack and checked her compass. The entrance to the cave system was 2 miles ahead, hidden behind a cluster of boulders that looked like 1,000 others scattered across this desolate landscape. But she knew exactly where to look. Morrison assembled the team around her. In the green glow of their night vision equipment, she could see doubt in some of their faces. These men had trained together for years. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. They could communicate with simple hand signals and trust that everyone would do their job. Sarah was an unknown quantity. Intel reports the compound is lightly guarded, she whispered. Hassan doesn't expect trouble. He's been here for 3 months without any military activity in the area. That works in our favor, but only if we can get inside without being detected. She pulled out a hand-drawn map, the result of hours studying satellite imagery. The cave entrance is here. The passage runs roughly northeast for about 2 miles, then splits into 3 branches. We take the middle branch. It opens into a natural chamber directly behind the main building. Petty Officer Rodriguez, the team's demolitions expert, studied the map. How do we know this middle passage is the right one? Sarah pointed to markings she had made on the paper. Water erosion patterns. The middle branch shows signs of regular water flow, which means it connects to the surface. The other 2 are dry, probably sealed by rockfall. It wasn't the kind of intelligence these men were used to relying on. Usually they had detailed floor plans, real-time surveillance, and multiple backup plans. Tonight they were trusting geological theory and satellite analysis. Morrison made the decision. We move in single file. Chin takes point since she knows the route. Rodriguez, you're right behind her with the charges. Williams and Jackson on communications. Peters and Davis watch our 6. The team moved out across the moonlit landscape. Sarah led them through terrain that looked identical in every direction, but she navigated by subtle differences in rock formations and the way shadows fell across the ground. Every step brought them closer to either success or disaster. After an hour of careful movement, they reached the cave entrance. It was exactly where Sarah's analysis had predicted, hidden behind a formation of rocks that created a natural blind spot from the valley below. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person carrying a full pack. Sarah knelt at the entrance and peered into the darkness. Her headlamp illuminated rough stone walls that disappeared into blackness. The passage angled downward at a steep slope. There was no turning back once they entered. Morrison crouched beside her. Last chance to reconsider. Once we're in there, we're committed. If this doesn't work, we won't have time for a backup plan. Sarah thought about all the lives that had been lost to Hassan's terrorist attacks. She thought about the families who would never see their loved ones again. She thought about the chance to finally bring justice to one of the world's most dangerous criminals. It'll work, she said, and stepped into the cave. The cave swallowed them whole. Sarah's headlamp carved a narrow cone of light through the absolute darkness as she crawled forward on her hands and knees. Behind her, she could hear the scraping of tactical gear against stone as 6 Navy SEALs followed her through a passage barely 3 feet high. The air was stale and cold. Each breath felt thin, and the weight of millions of tons of rock above them pressed down like a physical force. Sarah had studied these caves on computer screens, but being inside them was completely different. Every shadow could hide a dead end. Every sound echoed strangely in the confined space. How we doing up there, Chun? Morrison's voice whispered through her earpiece. On track, she replied, though doubt was creeping into her mind. The passage looked different than she had expected. Satellite data could show large geological features, but it couldn't reveal every twist and turn of a cave system carved by ancient water. The tunnel curved left, then right, then left again. Sarah navigated by memory, remembering the patterns she had traced on countless satellite images. But after 30 minutes of crawling, nothing looked familiar anymore. The walls were closer together than her analysis had suggested. The ceiling was lower, and there were side passages that shouldn't exist according to her maps. Rodriguez's voice came through the comm system. We sure this is the right way? Feels like we've been going in circles. Sarah paused and checked her compass. They were still heading generally northeast, but the magnetic reading was unreliable underground. She had been counting her movements, estimating distance based on the time it took to crawl. By her calculations, they should be about halfway to their destination. Stay focused, Morrison ordered. Chen knows what she's doing. But Sarah wasn't sure she did anymore. The confident intelligence analyst who had briefed Pentagon officials was being replaced by someone who realized that real caves didn't always match computer models. The rock around them felt alive, pressing in from all sides. Every decision could lead them deeper into a maze with no exit. The passage opened into a wider chamber, and Sarah was finally able to stand. She swept her light across the walls, looking for the 3 branches that should mark their halfway point. Instead, she found 5 different openings leading in all directions. This wasn't on any of her maps. Problem, she whispered into her mic. The team gathered around her in the chamber. In the artificial light of their headlamps, their faces looked ghostly and distorted. Sarah could see the concern in their eyes. These men had conducted operations in hostile territory around the world, but being lost underground was a different kind of fear. "Talk to me," Morrison said quietly. Sarah studied each of the 5 openings. The satellite data showed 3 branches here. There should be a main passage going northeast, and 2 smaller ones going north and southeast. But there are 5 passages, and I can't tell which is which. Williams, the team's communications specialist, checked his watch. "We've been underground for 45 minutes. At this rate, we'll be cutting it close on the timeline even if we find the right route now." Sarah knew he was right. Their window of opportunity was narrow. Hassan's compound followed a predictable schedule. Guards changed posts at specific times. Radio check-ins happened at regular intervals. If they missed their insertion window, the mission would have to be aborted. But choosing the wrong passage could be even worse. Some of these tunnels might lead nowhere. Others could emerge in full view of enemy sentries. And some might not emerge at all. "Let me think," Sarah said, kneeling down and closing her eyes. She forced herself to remember every detail of the geological surveys. Water flow patterns, elevation changes, the angle of approach to the target compound. The northeastern passage should show signs of regular water flow. In this dry climate, that meant mineral deposits left behind by centuries of seasonal flooding. She moved to each opening and examined the walls with her flashlight. The first passage was completely dry, with no water markings. The second showed some mineral staining, but it was old and minimal. The third passage had clear evidence of regular water flow, with smooth walls and mineral deposits that suggested an active underground stream. "This one," she said, pointing to the third opening. "The water patterns match what I saw in the geological data." Rodriguez looked skeptical. "You're betting our lives on water stains?" "I'm betting our lives on science," Sarah replied. "This passage has been carved by flowing water for thousands of years. That water has to go somewhere, and the only logical destination is the valley floor near our target." Morrison made the decision. "We follow Chen's lead. If she's wrong, we'll deal with it then. But right now, she's the expert we've got." They entered the third passage, which immediately angled downward at a steep slope. The walls were smooth and worn, exactly what Sarah would expect from long exposure to flowing water. But the passage was also narrower than the entrance tunnel, forcing them back onto their hands and knees. As they crawled deeper underground, Sarah began to notice something else. The air was moving. Just a slight breeze, barely perceptible, but definitely flowing from ahead of them toward the entrance behind them. Moving air meant the passage connected to the surface somewhere ahead. "I feel airflow," she whispered into her mic. "We're on the right track." The tunnel continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Sarah's knees were raw from crawling over rough stone. Her shoulders ached from the weight of her pack in the confined space. Behind her, she could hear the seals breathing heavily as they pushed through the same uncomfortable conditions. But they kept moving. Finally, the passage began to angle upward. The airflow became stronger, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and cooking food. They were getting close to the compound. Sarah paused as the tunnel opened into another chamber, this one larger than the previous one. Her flashlight revealed smooth walls and a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. More importantly, she could see a faint glow coming from somewhere ahead. Natural light. They had reached the end of their underground journey. "We're here," she whispered. The chamber was exactly as her analysis had predicted. The ancient riverbed had carved a natural room directly behind the terrorist compound. Somewhere above them, Hassan and his followers were going about their daily routines, completely unaware that American Special Forces had just traveled 2 miles through solid rock to reach them. Morrison moved up beside Sarah and studied the chamber. A narrow opening in the far wall showed the source of the natural light. Beyond that opening lay their target. "Outstanding work, Chun," he said quietly. "I don't know many intelligence analysts who could have navigated that route." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the most dangerous part of their mission was still ahead. Getting to the compound unseen had been the first challenge. Now they had to capture or eliminate one of the world's most wanted terrorists and escape safely. Rodriguez was already unpacking his demolition charges. Williams was setting up his communication equipment to signal their successful infiltration. The other team members were checking their weapons and preparing for the assault phase. But as Sarah moved toward the opening that would take them into the compound, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dust. Boot prints that were definitely not made by any of her team members. Someone else had been using these caves recently, and they might not be alone down here after all. She was about to alert Morrison when a voice echoed through the chamber. Speaking in accented English, calm and confident. "Welcome, American soldiers. We have been waiting for you." The chamber erupted into chaos. Automatic weapons fire echoed off the stone walls as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks. Sarah threw herself behind a large boulder as bullets sparked off the rocks around her. "Ambush. Take cover." Morrison's voice cut through the noise. The SEALs responded with the precision of their training, immediately spreading out and returning fire. But they were caught in the worst possible position. The chamber was essentially a kill zone with limited cover and no escape routes except the narrow tunnel they had crawled through. Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone and tried to understand what had gone wrong. Her analysis had been perfect. The satellite data was accurate. The cave system existed exactly as she had predicted. But somehow, the enemy had known they were coming. "Chun, how many ways out of here?" Morrison shouted over the gunfire. Sarah forced herself to think clearly despite the terror coursing through her veins. She had memorized every geological survey of this area. There should be only 2 openings to this chamber. The passage they had come through, and the exit leading to the compound above. But the enemy fire was coming from at least 3 different directions. "There's another passage," she called back. Something not on the maps. A grenade clattered across the stone floor and exploded 20 feet away. Shrapnel ricocheted off the walls as dust and smoke filled the air. Sarah could hear Morrison coordinating his team's response, but their situation was desperate. Through the chaos, she could make out voices speaking in Arabic. The enemy fighters were discussing positions, coordinating their attack, and one voice stood out from the others. Calm, controlled, giving orders. Hassan, the man they had come to capture, was personally directing the ambush. "Rodriguez, can you get charges on that north wall?" Morrison called out. "Negative. Too much fire." Sarah realized they were trapped in a carefully planned trap. Hassan hadn't just known they were coming. He had known exactly how they would arrive. The cave system that had seemed like their secret advantage had become their prison. But as she crouched behind the boulder, Sarah's mind was racing through everything she knew about this underground complex. There had to be something in her research that could help them. Some detail that could turn the situation around. The geological surveys had shown unusual mineral deposits in this area. Iron or mixed with limestone, creating a unique rock formation. And iron or meant something important. Magnetic interference. "Morrison," she shouted. "Their communications. The iron in these rocks should be blocking radio signals." She could see Morrison's eyes widen as he understood the implication. Hassan's fighters were coordinating their attack too well for people who should have been cut off from outside communication, which meant they weren't relying on radios. They had wired the cave system. Sarah forced herself to think like an intelligence analyst instead of a terrified soldier. If Hassan had prepared this ambush in advance, he would have needed some way to coordinate with his fighters. Running communication lines through the caves would be the only reliable method, and communication lines could be disrupted. "Williams," Morrison barked. "Find their comm lines. Cut their coordination." Williams immediately understood. While his teammates provided covering fire, he began tracing along the walls, looking for the wiring that had to be hidden somewhere in the chamber. Sarah spotted movement in the passage leading to the compound above. More fighters were arriving to join the ambush. At this rate, they would be overwhelmed within minutes. But she also noticed something else. The new fighters were moving cautiously, feeling their way in the darkness. They weren't wearing night vision equipment. Hassan's force was relying on pre-positioned lighting and knowledge of the terrain. The Americans had the technological advantage if they could use it properly. "Cut the lights," Sarah yelled. "They can't see in the dark." Morrison immediately grasped her strategy. "Everyone, kill your headlamps. Switch to night vision. Rodriguez, take out those light sources." The chamber plunged into complete darkness as the SEALs switched off their lights and activated their night vision equipment. Rodriguez began systematically destroying the battery-powered lights that Hassan's fighters had positioned around the chamber. The enemy's coordinated fire immediately became more erratic. Voices called out in confusion as they lost visual contact with their targets. The Americans could now see clearly while their opponents were effectively blind. But Hassan's voice cut through the confusion, speaking rapidly in Arabic. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the tone. He was adapting to the situation, giving new orders. "He's pulling them back," she told Morrison. "Regrouping for a different attack." "Good. Gives us time to move." Morrison was already shifting position, using the darkness to relocate his team to better defensive positions. Williams had found the communication wires running along the eastern wall of the chamber. With a pair of wire cutters, he severed the lines that Hassan had used to coordinate his forces. The effect was immediate. The enemy voices became louder and more confused as they lost their ability to communicate with fighters in other parts of the cave system. But Sarah knew their advantage would be temporary. Hassan was too experienced to stay confused for long. He would adapt, find new ways to coordinate his forces. And, eventually, sheer numbers would overwhelm the American team. They needed to go on the offensive. "Morrison," she said, crawling over to where the team leader had taken position. "I know how to get behind them. Talk to me." Sarah pulled out her geological survey notes, reading them by the green glow of her night vision. "There's a secondary passage that connects to the main compound. It's not on any of Hassan's maps because it was sealed by a rockfall decades ago. But the blockage is just loose stones. We could clear it." "Where?" Sarah pointed to what looked like a solid wall on the western side of the chamber. "Behind that rock face. The survey data shows the passage continues for about 50 meters, then opens into the compound's storage area." Morrison studied the wall she indicated. It looked completely solid, but Sarah's analysis had been correct about everything else so far. "How long to clear it?" 10 minutes with explosives. Maybe less. Morrison made his decision. "Rodriguez, we're going through that wall. Prep your charges." As Rodriguez began setting demolition charges against the rock face, Sarah realized she was about to do something she had never trained for. She was about to enter active combat against one of the most dangerous terrorists in the world. But as the explosives detonated and the ancient rockfall collapsed into rubble, she also realized something else. For the first time since entering the caves, she wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry. Hassan had turned her carefully planned mission into a death trap. He had used her own intelligence against her, attempting to kill the very people who trusted her leadership. Now it was time to show him what a Pentagon intelligence analyst could do when she stopped thinking like a desk officer and started thinking like a warrior. The explosion that cleared the rock wall echoed through the underground complex like thunder. Sarah felt the concussion wave pass through her body as tons of ancient stone collapsed into dust and rubble. When the debris settled, Rodriguez had opened a hole just large enough for a person to crawl through. "Passage is clear," he reported. Morrison immediately began repositioning his team. "Williams, Peters, hold this position. Keep Hassan's people pinned down. The rest of us go through the wall." Sarah found herself moving toward the newly opened passage before she fully realized what she was doing. 3 months of analyzing intelligence reports and satellite imagery had been leading to this moment. The terrorist responsible for countless innocent deaths was somewhere beyond that hole in the rock. "Chun, you stay here," Morrison ordered. "This is combat ops now." "No." Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. "You need me. I'm the only one who knows the layout of this compound in detail. Every room, every corridor, every possible hiding spot. Morrison hesitated. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. Every instinct told him to keep the intelligence analyst out of active combat. But she was right about knowing the compound better than anyone else. "You stay behind me at all times," he said finally. "You don't engage unless there's no choice. Your job is navigation and intelligence, nothing else." Sarah nodded and checked her sidearm. She had qualified as expert marksman in training, but had never fired a shot in anger. Tonight that might change. Rodriguez went through the passage first, followed by Morrison. Sarah crawled through third, with Jackson and Davis bringing up the rear. The passage was exactly as her geological analysis had predicted. 50 meters of rough-carved stone that opened into what had once been a storage area for the ancient settlement. They emerged in a room filled with wooden crates and supply containers. Sarah recognized it immediately from the satellite imagery analysis. They were in the northwest corner of the compound, behind the main residential building where Hassan was most likely hiding. Morrison hand-signaled for silence and moved to the doorway. Beyond it lay a courtyard surrounded by mud-brick buildings. Sarah had memorized every detail of this layout during her mission preparation. "Hassan's quarters should be in the central building," she whispered. "Second floor, eastern side. But there will be guards posted throughout the compound." As if summoned by her words, footsteps echoed in the courtyard outside. Morrison held up his fist, signaling the team to freeze. Through the doorway, Sarah could see 2 armed guards walking a patrol route. They were moving casually, unaware that American Special Forces had just infiltrated their stronghold through a passage that wasn't supposed to exist. Morrison waited until the guards passed, then led his team into the courtyard. Sarah felt completely exposed under the star-filled sky after hours underground. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. Every sound could trigger an alarm that would bring dozens of terrorists running. But they moved like ghosts across the open space, using cover and concealment techniques that had been perfected through years of special operations. Sarah found herself adapting to their rhythm, moving when they moved, freezing when they froze. They reached the central building without detection. Morrison positioned Davis and Jackson to cover the exits while he, Rodriguez, and Sarah prepared to enter the structure. The door was unlocked. Hassan's confidence in his remote location had made him careless about basic security measures. Morrison slipped inside with Sarah close behind. The interior was exactly as she had imagined from studying floor plans derived from satellite thermal imaging. A central hallway with rooms branching off on both sides. Stairs leading to the second floor where Hassan maintained his personal quarters. But as they started up the stairs, Sarah heard something that made her freeze. Voices speaking in English. American English. "The charges are set on the main entrance," someone was saying. "When the rest of their team tries to follow them through that tunnel, we'll bring the whole thing down on top of them." Sarah grabbed Morrison's arm. Hassan wasn't just defending against their attack. He was preparing to trap and kill Williams and Peters, the 2 SEALs they had left behind in the cave chamber. "We have to warn them," she whispered. Morrison was already reaching for his radio when they heard Hassan's voice from the floor above, speaking in accented but perfect English. "Let them come," Hassan said. "I want the woman alive. She is the one who found this place. Her intelligence work has been quite impressive. I have plans for her." Sarah felt ice in her veins. Hassan knew exactly who she was. This wasn't just a military operation that had been discovered. This was a personal trap designed specifically for her. Morrison's eyes met hers in the dim light of the hallway. They both understood the implications. Hassan had somehow obtained detailed intelligence about their mission, including Sarah's role in planning it. The entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. But they had come too far to turn back now. Morrison keyed his radio, whispering urgently, "Williams, Peters, abort your position. Compound has charges set on the tunnel entrance. Fall back now." Static crackled through his earpiece. Then, Williams' voice came through faintly. "Copy that. Moving to alternate position. At least Williams and Peters might escape the trap." But Sarah and the assault team were now deep inside enemy territory with no clear escape route. Hassan's voice continued from upstairs. "She thinks like a man, but fights like a woman. Cautious, analytical. She will try to gather more intelligence before acting. This gives us the advantage." Sarah felt anger flare inside her chest. Hassan was using her own personality profile against her, predicting her actions based on psychological analysis. He had studied her just as thoroughly as she had studied him. But there was one thing Hassan didn't know about her. When Sarah Chun was 8 years old, her family's house had caught fire in the middle of the night. While her parents panicked and neighbors called the fire department, Sarah had calmly analyzed the situation. She identified the safest escape route, gathered important documents, and led her family to safety through a smoke-filled hallway that everyone else thought was blocked. She had learned that day that sometimes the most analytical thing to do was to stop analyzing and start acting. Sarah looked at Morrison and made a decision that would either save their mission or get them all killed. "Change of plans," she whispered. "Hassan expects me to be cautious and analytical. Let's show him what happens when an intelligence analyst decides to kick down the front door." Morrison stared at her for a moment, then smiled grimly. "What did you have in mind?" Sarah pulled out a flashbang grenade she had been carrying for emergencies. "You said Hassan wants me alive. Let's use that against him. I'm going up those stairs, and when he tries to capture me, you and Rodriguez hit him from behind." "That's insane. You'll be completely exposed." "Exactly. He won't expect it. Sometimes the best intelligence operation is the one that makes no sense." Before Morrison could object, Sarah pulled the pin on the flashbang, counted to 3, and threw it up the stairway. The explosion lit up the building like lightning as she charged up the stairs, her sidearm drawn and ready. Behind her, she could hear Morrison and Rodriguez following her into what Hassan had intended to be her kill zone. But Sarah Chun was done being anyone's victim. Sarah reached the top of the stairs as the flashbang's aftershock still rang in her ears. The second-floor hallway was filled with smoke and confusion. Through the haze, she could see armed figures stumbling around, temporarily blinded and disoriented by the explosion. But Hassan was nowhere to be seen. "Left room." Morrison's voice cut through the noise as he and Rodriguez reached the landing behind her. Sarah kicked open the door Morrison had indicated, her weapon raised and ready. The room was empty except for communication equipment and maps spread across a wooden table. Radio chatter in multiple languages crackled from speakers mounted on the wall. Hassan was coordinating more than just the compound's defenses. He was running active operations across the entire region. "Chun." Movement in the courtyard. Rodriguez called from a window overlooking the central area. Sarah looked down to see Hassan himself crossing the open space, flanked by 4 bodyguards. He was retreating toward a building on the far side of the compound. But he wasn't running in panic. His movement was controlled, purposeful. He was falling back to a prepared position. "He's got a backup plan," Sarah realized. "That building on the south side. It's not just another structure. Look at the way it's positioned." Morrison joined her at the window and studied the building Hassan was approaching. It sat at the highest point of the compound with clear sight lines in all directions. More importantly, it was positioned to control the only vehicle access road leading out of the valley. "Command bunker," Morrison agreed. "If he gets in there, he can coordinate his entire force and call for reinforcements." Sarah was already moving toward the stairs. "Not if we get there first." They descended quickly, but by the time they reached the courtyard, Hassan and his bodyguards had disappeared into the fortified building. Sarah could see defensive positions that hadn't been visible in the satellite imagery. Hidden fighting positions, overlapping fields of fire, carefully constructed kill zones. Hassan had turned the entire compound into a fortress, and they were walking directly into his strongest defensive position. "This is suicide," Rodriguez muttered. "That building is designed to withstand a full assault." Sarah studied the structure with the same analytical mind that had led them through the cave system. Hassan had made one critical error in his defensive planning. He had focused on protecting against a conventional military attack. He had prepared for helicopters, ground vehicles, and large assault forces. But he hadn't prepared for what Sarah was about to do. "The building has underground storage," she said, remembering details from the geological surveys. "Connected to the same cave system we came through. If I can get back underground, I can approach from below while you two create a distraction from the front." Morrison shook his head. "We're not splitting up. We stay together." "Listen to me," Sarah said urgently. "Hassan knows how special operations teams work. He's prepared for coordinated assault tactics. But he's not prepared for an intelligence analyst who thinks like a geologist. She pointed to a barely visible depression in the ground near the fortified building. That's a sinkhole. It connects to the underground water system. I can get inside through the foundation while you keep his attention focused on the main entrance. Before Morrison could respond, automatic weapons fire erupted from the building. Hassan's fighters had spotted them in the courtyard and were attempting to pin them down. "Move!" Morrison shouted. They sprinted across the open space, using abandoned vehicles and supply containers for cover. Sarah could hear bullets cracking through the air around her head. This was nothing like the training simulations she had experienced. Real combat was louder, more chaotic, and infinitely more terrifying. But she kept moving. They reached the base of the fortified building as explosion echoed from the direction of the cave entrance. Hassan had triggered the charges meant to trap Williams and Peters. Sarah hoped Morrison's warning had reached them in time. "Give me 5 minutes," Sarah told Morrison as she approached the sinkhole she had identified. "When you hear shooting from inside the building, that's your signal to assault the front entrance." "Chun, wait." But Sarah was already lowering herself into the sinkhole. The opening was narrow and steep, dropping straight down into the underground water system. As she descended, she could hear Morrison and Rodriguez beginning their diversionary attack on the building's front entrance. The sinkhole connected to a natural drain that carried seasonal runoff from the compound. Sarah found herself crawling through another narrow passage, but this one was different from the caves they had traversed earlier. This passage was wet, carved by flowing water, and led directly under Hassan's stronghold. She emerged in a basement storage area filled with weapons, ammunition, and communication equipment. Hassan had been planning operations on a scale much larger than anyone had suspected. The intelligence value of this discovery alone would justify the entire mission. But first, she had to survive the next few minutes. Sarah could hear gunfire directly above her head as Morrison and Rodriguez engaged Hassan's fighters. She found a stairway leading up to the main level of the building. At the top of the stairs was a heavy wooden door. Sarah paused and listened to the sounds coming from the other side. Hassan's voice, speaking rapidly in Arabic, coordinating his defense. She counted at least 3 other voices responding to his orders. For armed terrorists, plus, however, many bodyguards Hassan had brought with him. Sarah was outnumbered 4-1, armed only with her sidearm and whatever element of surprise she could maintain. But she had spent 3 months studying every detail of Hassan's life and operations. She knew his personality, his tactics, his psychological profile, and she knew his greatest weakness: Hassan's arrogance. He believed he was always the smartest person in the room. He couldn't imagine that an American intelligence analyst would have the courage to face him directly. Sarah took a deep breath, checked her weapon one final time, and kicked open the door. Hassan was standing at a window directing his fighter's defense when Sarah burst into the room. For just a moment, their eyes met across the smoke-filled space. She could see the shock and disbelief in his expression. The most wanted terrorist in the world had not expected to face a Pentagon analyst in personal combat. Sarah raised her weapon and spoke clearly despite the chaos around them. "Ahmed Hassan, by the authority of the United States military, you are under arrest." Hassan smiled coldly and reached for the pistol on his belt. "I think not, Miss Chun. You are very far from your computer screens now." The room exploded into violence as Hassan's bodyguards opened fire. Sarah dove behind a desk as bullets shattered the windows around her. But she had anticipated this moment for months. She knew exactly what Hassan would do next, and she was ready for him. As Hassan tried to reach his escape route, Sarah stepped into his path. For the first time in her life, she fired her weapon in combat. Not at a training target or a paper silhouette, but at one of the most dangerous men alive. The shot was perfect, just as it had been 100 times on the practice range. Hassan fell, his reign of terror finally, ended by the intelligence analyst he had underestimated. When Morrison and Rodriguez fought their way into the building moments later, they found Sarah securing the scene with the professionalism of a veteran operator. "Compound secure," she reported. "Primary target neutralized. Ready for extraction." Morrison looked at her with something approaching awe. "Remind me never to doubt Pentagon intelligence again." As helicopters approached for their extraction, Sarah allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. She had proven that sometimes the most effective weapon against terrorism wasn't superior firepower or advanced technology. Sometimes it was simply refusing to accept that evil people were untouchable. The SEALs had dropped their guns in shock not because they were outfought, but because they had witnessed something they had never seen before. An intelligence analyst who had transformed herself into a warrior when her country needed her most. Sarah Chun had entered the kill zone and emerged victorious. And she had done it by thinking like the analyst she was, while fighting like the soldier she had become.